Hello, cybersecurity and national security class, and welcome to Class 2, the online portion of Class 2 in our module on cybersecurity and national security. In this lecture, we will talk about national security law in the United States, and in particular, we'll look at the United States Constitution's provision for war powers. We will talk a bit about the separation of powers doctrine. We'll look at the War Powers Act and some of its specific provisions and limitations, and we will look at some case law that relates to the War Powers Act. Along the way, we'll make some comparisons between all this and our concepts of cyberspace and internet governance and the idea of war or conflict in cyberspace. We'll save a lot of that discussion for when we meet together in class. So if you remember in class last week, we began to talk about the constitutional framework of the separation of powers. And we talked about some deep historical background going back all the way to the 30 Years' War and the rise of the nation state. And then we talked about the concept of separation of powers, and we talked a bit about the U.S. historical context that leads to the framers' early concerns about control over the military and about the separation of powers. So let's spend a little bit of time looking at some specific text in the Constitution. And the first piece that we look at here is Article 1. And Article 1, of course, lays out the legislative power. Article 2 lays out the executive power. Article 3 lays out the judicial power. And there we have our separation of powers. So within Article 1, Section 8 are the enumerated powers of Congress. So within Section 8, among those enumerated powers is the power to declare war. So Congress, according to the constitutional separation of powers, is the body that has the power to declare war. Notice also these other military-related items, letters of marque and reprisal. These probably relate originally to piracy on the high seas. And making rules concerning the capture of vessels on land and water. Then another enumerated power that Congress has is to raise and support armies. Notice that there is a limit on the congressional appropriation that can be used to raise and support an army. Congress also has the power to provide and maintain a navy. And Congress has the power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. So the ability to declare war, the ability to make appropriations to raise and support a navy and an army, and the ability to make rules and regulations governing the army and the navy falls within the legislative branch to Congress. Congress also has a number of other powers relating to the conduct of the armed forces. So notice here in the Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress has the authority to call forth the militia if it's necessary to execute the laws of the Union, suppress an insurrection, or repel an invasion. To provide for the organizing, arming, disciplining of the militia and governing the militia to the extent that it's employed in the service of the United States. And then, kind of at the end of all of the enumerated powers, and there are a number of other enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, of course, that don't directly address war power or the armies or militia, it indicates that it's sort of a catch-all that Congress has the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution all of the other foregoing powers. One important limitation on Congress in Article 1 relating to the war powers and separation of powers is the restriction on suspending the writ of habeas corpus. This has become an important issue, of course, today in the war on terror and the question of the legality of detaining terror suspects indefinitely at Guantanamo Bay. But notice the language here. The privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So the limitation on the power to suspend the writ is not absolute. It's qualified by a necessity requirement. Article 1, Section 10 contains an interesting limitation on the states with respect to war-related activities and making war. So it states that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, keep troops or ships of war in a time of peace or engage in war. Now, I think that probably that latter part, a state shall not engage in war, is pretty intuitive, maybe assumed by us today, that an individual state, like Texas, say, wouldn't go to war with a foreign power on its own. That wasn't obviously necessarily entirely clear at the time of the founding. But do notice that there is a really fascinating qualification in this clause, because in this section, because it indicates that a state can go to war if it is actually invaded or is in imminent danger in such a way that it will not admit of a delay. In other words, a state has been invaded or is about to be invaded. The state can respond, at least according to this section, on its own with military force. So now we move into Article 2, the executive power, and Article 2, Section 2 gives a provision that I think most of us are probably familiar with, which is that the President is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Notice also that the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states, and notice this qualification when called into the actual service of the United States. Article 2, Section 3 is a general provision about the executive, not limited to war powers, but it indicates that the executive is responsible to take care that the laws of the United States be faithfully executed, and also indicates that the President will commission any officers of the United States.